Thank you, everybody. I think we should probably get things rolling. Just wanted to give a quick introduction to the data sharing working group that we will be having over the occurrence of AOS. A little bit of background or kind of how our sessions tie together. So we have 4 sessions in our breakout. It's starting with today's session on Indigenous data sovereignty and capacity sharing. It's kind of more of a generalized, idea and overview of Indigenous data sovereignty, and then that will flow into tomorrow's session of our Indigenous data sovereignty from the technical perspective, and we'll have more of representatives from various organizations, repositories, and whatnot, giving their technical perspective on how to approach Indigenous data sovereignty, and then we will flow that into our SAV, which is our shared Arctic variable, say on roads work, at the morning of day 3, and how to integrate SAVs into existing data systems and networks, and then finally we cap it off with a more general nitty-gritty of the data interoperability and how do you actually, implement interoperability at the various levels, your metadata level, your data sharing level, or data set level, and as well as possibly going to algorithm levels. So that's kind of big overview. Part of a little bit of context too is from our last AOS, which was in Tromsø about 2 years ago. We just wanted to expand and give the space to the more topicality of data sovereignty in general, and how do we approach this from a technical and organizational perspective. So hopefully we can address that and come up with some recommendations by the end of AOS. But with that said, I will hand it over to our today's chairs, and thank you all for joining us, and looking forward to the sessions and a successful AOS. Hello. Whoa, that's loud. Sorry.
We have a mic on our table.
Okay, cool.
We really don't need this.
That was aggressive. Hi, everybody. Welcome to day 1. I'm excited to be here. I'm a little jet lagged. I don't know everybody else. My name's Tosh. I work for ELOKA, which is the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic. I'm not going to talk too much because we kind of want to fit in a lot before having time for the group discussion. But thank you. This session is a big collaborative effort from Joshua Brown, who's online, Nora Johnson, Hannah Marie Garcia, Vanessa Raymond, Bruce Robson, and others. And we're going to start with a short presentation. I wanted to get a quick just raise of hands. Who is familiar with Indigenous data sovereignty? Got some hands. Okay, so we were that's great. So we did want to spend just a little bit of time to hear from the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. The Collaboratory is based out of the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, with members from the US, Australia, and New Zealand who have been helping define Indigenous data sovereignty and articulate elements of its practice. 2 years ago, Stephanie Russo gave a keynote at AOS focusing on Indigenous data sovereignty, and we asked the Collaboratory to give a framing to help open this session. The talk is about 15 minutes, and then we'll hear from our panelists. And the point is just to really spark some discussion, get the mental juices flowing, and then we'll have some time for group discussion.
Okay, so we're ready for the video. Oh, good.
Great.
Let's play from that one then.
Cool. So seamless.
Except for the volume.
Is it right here? That one? Should I make it?
Yeah.
Buenas and half the day to Samzu Bakusi Riley Taitingfong. My name is Riley, and I am a postdoc at the University of Arizona's Native Nations Institute. I am Chamorro, so I'm indigenous to the Mariana Islands in Micronesia, specifically the island of Guam, and I'm also of mixed European descent. And I'm really grateful to have some space today to share this presentation on Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. So thank you for letting us highlight some of our work and for letting us do so asynchronously. So first I want to acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of many Indigenous peoples. The state of Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, and Tucson is home to the O'odham and Yaqui peoples. I also want to acknowledge that the content I'll share with you today is made possible through the collaboration and contributions of folks like my PI, Stephanie Carroll, and my colleagues, Andrew Martinez, Dr. Lydia Jennings, Dr. Ibrahim Garba, and many others. I would also encourage you to please check out the URLs on the slide to learn more about the work that we do through the Collaboratory for Indigenous Governance and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA. Okay, so I'm going to split this presentation into two parts. First, I'll provide some background on Indigenous data sovereignty and the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And then I'm going to close with a sort of collection of examples of CARE implementation and in action through various projects and across different domains. Okay. So I like to start by acknowledging that Indigenous peoples have always been data experts. So you may recognize some of the images across the slide. These are different physical mechanisms that Indigenous peoples have used since time immemorial to store and transmit information. And so from the left, going clockwise, this is an O'odham calendar stick, a wampum belt, the Lakota winter count, and a Marshallese stick chart. And that comes from the part of the world from which my ancestors hail and is used for oceanic navigation. The other tools here are used for a variety of things, recording significant historical events, recording important information about Indigenous peoples' human and non-human relations, or even working in the case of the wampum belt as a sort of living treaty, right? Sort of communicating different protocols and standards for how people live together. And so in each case, Indigenous peoples have always had many roles, responsibilities, and protocols for stewarding the information, stewarding the knowledge systems that are held through these and other mechanisms. And so when we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance, we're really talking about taking Indigenous peoples' roles and responsibilities for the care of their knowledge systems and instilling those in digital infrastructures, instilling those in the policy and practice that determine how data are used across the entire data ecosystem and life cycle. Okay, to put a bit of a finer point on Indigenous data sovereignty, this refers to the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. And so we like to highlight that Indigenous data sovereignty is really Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations to have and to practice, right? It's derived in the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to self-determine around the use of their territories, their resources. And again, it is about upholding the kinds of roles and responsibilities Indigenous peoples have for their knowledge systems and their information. It's also positioned within a human rights frameworks and various treaties and legal and extra-legal mechanisms. For example, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. And then finally, we like to also emphasize that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to Indigenous peoples. Okay, and then also to offer a bit of definition around what Indigenous data are. We define Indigenous data as any data, information, and knowledges in any format that impact Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities at both collective and individual levels. So this can include data about our non-human relations, data about us as individual people, and data about us as collectives, including our cultural knowledges, languages, and more. And so Indigenous data sovereignty, again, refers to the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine the use of their data from collection to use and reuse. And Indigenous data governance refers to the particular protocols and mechanisms in place that can uphold Indigenous data sovereignty. And so we like to also highlight that Indigenous data governance has long been practiced by a variety of people and parties across many scales. And so at sort of a broad or international level, you can have principles such as the CARE principles, which I'll say more about in subsequent slides. You also have principles at the regional level, for example, OCAP, from a First Nations context, that's ownership, control, access, and possession, or the principles of Maori data sovereignty out of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then of course you also have various kinds of policies, protocols, laws, codes at the level of particular tribes or indigenous nations. And so one thing to highlight about CARE is that this is really this high level set of standards or guidance for those interacting with indigenous data. And we always hope that the CARE principles can also point you home to any regional or nation-specific principles that relate to the communities, nations, or tribes with whom you may work. Okay, now to give you a bit of background on how the CARE principles came about. So some years ago, as a collection of Indigenous and allied scholars were working together to sort of compare what are the differences between mainstream data principles and Indigenous peoples' principles for the governance of their data. And so in mainstream principles, what they found is that these tended to really be more data-centric. So for example, the FAIR principles. These were more focused on findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. So again, really focused on the data themselves. Alternatively, Indigenous peoples' principles for data tended to really be more people and purpose-oriented. And so this is sort of where the impetus for the CARE principles came about, was out of interest of really reinstilling the people and purpose orientation back into data principles. And so the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance include CAR&E, this stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, and include 3 sub-principles under each. And so you can read in more detail about this if you haven't before in the paper in the CODATA journal from Stephanie Carroll and colleagues. But just to kind of sum up for each, collective benefit is really about ensuring that data ecosystems make possible the benefit of Indigenous peoples, right, from those data. Authority to control, we really see as sort of the heart of the CARE principles, which refers to different ways of recognizing and upholding Indigenous peoples' rights in relationship to their data. Responsibility is sort of highlighting everyone from individual researchers to institutions that interface with Indigenous data, everybody's responsibility to ensure that those data are used in ways that, again, support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And then finally, E-ethics has to do with sort of centering Indigenous people's rights and well-being across the data lifecycle and data ecosystem. Excuse me. And so we like to highlight that the FAIR principles and CARE principles, excuse me, I need some water. We like to highlight that FAIR and CARE are complementary, meaning they should be implemented together. And we see their kind of twin implementation as really necessary for achieving Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. So the adage goes, be fair and care, and also in thinking about sort of the balance between responsibilities to open sharing and open science mandates and the CARE principles, we like to say as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And so in the second part of this presentation, I'm going to give you some examples that sort of show across different domains how different individuals and entities are sort of codifying, operationalizing their responsibilities to Indigenous data governance. Alrighty. So I want to start by acknowledging one project that I lead in my postdoc, which is the development of the CARE criteria, which is essentially an assessment tool for individuals or institutions who want to evaluate how well they're sort of doing Indigenous data governance in their setting. And this is something that we're modeling after the FAIR data maturity model. And so we also call it the CARE data maturity model. And again, I won't read every single line of this slide at you, but this sort of just gives you an idea of the kinds of activities that we see as potentially constituting C, A, R, and E. So keeping in mind that this is very much still in development, you are welcome to have a look at this to maybe inspire some areas of action in your own contexts. Okay, so now I'll pull out a couple of examples that sort of demonstrate those activities across CAR and E. And so one example that might come out under the A, authority to control, and specifically the importance of recognizing Indigenous data sovereignty is this practice of including Indigenous data sovereignty statements, for example, on an organization's public-facing website. And so this comes from one of our partners based in Europe, the Local Indicators of Climate Change Impacts Observation Network, or LICHION, and they have their IDSOV statement downloadable on their homepage, which sort of outlines their own recognition and their sort of responsibilities to IDSOV in the work that they do. I'd also like to highlight the Local Contexts organization. If you haven't heard of them, please check out their website to learn more about the work they do. But one thing that they've created are these digital tags. They're various kinds of institutional notices and also different kinds of labels. These sort of function as extra legal tools to really signify that there are particular rights, Indigenous rights that can sit in relationship to data within a particular project or repository and so on. And so one example of these sort of in situ, it comes from the Maine Environmental DNA Project, and they have implemented, for example, the Open to Collaborate notice. And this is communicating that their institution, holds Indigenous data and that it's committed to developing partnerships, collaboration with the relevant tribes in relation to those data. Okay, and you can also see that they've implemented a biocultural notice, which is, again, signifying their particular cultural rights that sit in relationship to particular data that they have. And so this is just a real small snapshot of the kinds of labels and notices available through Local Context. So again, please check out their website to learn more. We also wanted to highlight data sharing agreements as just one kind of tool, albeit, can be sort of a limited tool, but just one piece of the larger picture of tools and strategies for sort of codifying your organization or project's sort of responsibilities and specific practices and protocols for Indigenous data governance. And so we recommend this framework from Krista Yao out of FNIGC in a First Nations context, includes some really great guidance for writing strong data sharing agreements that instill IDSOV and IDGov. And then you can also find this online, but this is something that some members of our team have drafted in the past that is sort of a template for a data sharing agreement oriented around the CARE principles. In a First Nations context, includes some really great guidance for writing strong data sharing agreements that instill IDSOV and IDGov. And then you can also find this online, but this is something that some members of our team have drafted in the past that is sort of a template for a data sharing agreement oriented around the CARE principles. Okay, here's one example that has to do with the deposit of data. This comes from the University of Arizona Library's Read Data Archives policies. And so this policy is indicating that any data associated with Indigenous lands, peoples, and resources has to meet these particular policies and approval processes before it can be deposited in the Read Data Archive. And so, for example, there's approval mandated by particular tribal designees and other policies. Okay, just a few more examples here. This is a joint statement out of a couple of journals that publish papers about rural health. And so basically they're codifying their commitment to publish nothing about Indigenous people without Indigenous people. And they go so far as to say that their editorial boards will reject any papers that are submitted about Indigenous communities that do not acknowledge an Indigenous author or provide evidence that some inclusive process of Indigenous community engagement was taken. So an example from a publishing setting. Okay, and then this example comes out of Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is the Ngā Tikanga Paihiri framework. And so we like this under E for ethics in care, the importance of centering Indigenous people's own ethics and values in the development of data standards and practices and protocols. And so please read more about this at the Ngā Tikanga Paihiri webpage linked here. But this is something that, you know, individual researchers can use in trying to understand Māori cultural frameworks and principles for the use of data, and has also had some implementation at a federal level. And so again, in remembering that we hope the care principles point you home to the particular protocols of tribes or nations with whom you may work, this is a great example of one resource that can help with that. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here and also just shout out this paper from Dr. Lydia Jennings that may be of interest to some of you who do, you know, kind of Arctic focus ecology or biodiversity or environmental research. This paper goes into some more detail of some examples of care and practice and just offers some great guidance and conversation for implementing the care principles in this kind of research. And then I also want to acknowledge or shout out the upcoming summit on U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Governance that we are hosting in Tucson next month. So I hope some of you plan to join us there. Our in-person registration is mostly sold out. I think we have still an active waitlist you can join if you're hoping to be there in person. And we also have a virtual option available as well. Okay, I'm going to say Saina Mase. Thank you so much for the space to share. Want to acknowledge also the many organizations with whom we partner and who support this work. And please feel free, if you have any questions or want to learn more about any of the work we've mentioned, to reach out to me at rtaitingfong@arizona.edu. Okay, Saina Mase. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your summit.
Huge thanks to the Collaboratory for that presentation. And now I'd like to move to the panel where we'll ask some questions and then we'll start the group discussion. So if I could have the panelists come up, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So I'd like to start with some introductions, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself just quickly. So Roberta, you're in the hot seat.
Hello. Is it on? Oh yeah, it is. Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Roberta Turuk Glenbarade. I was born and raised in Utqiagvik, Alaska, formerly known as Barrow. I work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks for the Alaska Arctic Observatory and Knowledge Hub. We're a community-based environmental monitoring network. And I help to lead that project and maintain our relationships with our community partners as a coordinator and community liaison. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am in the process of relearning some language, and I worked with my grandmother last night, so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to introduce myself in Lakota. Hihani washte mitakiwapi Hannah Marie Imachiapi. So, good morning. My name is Yoi. Thank you. I've got a teacher here. My name is Hannah Marie Garcia. I am of European and Spanish and Native American descent. I was born in Fort Collins, Colorado, but I traveled here today from Denina Lands, Anchorage, Alaska, where I now currently live and work. I work for the Aleut community of St. Paul Islands tribal government as the director for the Indigenous Sentinels Network program. ISN. ISN is an Indigenous-led and community-driven environmental monitoring program where we provide software and tools and programmatic support to help with community-driven data collection. And I'm really excited to be on this panel and just thank you for the space and the time to be here and excited for our discussion.
I said "yoy," which means "oh, good," like in my language. Uvanga Cana Itchuaqiyak. Norvingmi, Kikik Dagrammi. My name is Cana Itchuaqiyak. I am from Kotzebue, but I'm actually really from Norvik, Alaska, up in northwest Alaska. And my parents are Gladys Pungawi from Norvik, and my dad is Caleb Pungawi from Savunga on St. Lawrence Island in the Bering Sea. I am currently an assistant professor of technical and scientific communication at Virginia Tech, and I am the academic PI versus the entire PI I am the academic PI for the Rematriation Project, which is a project about digital and data literacies using the community need for community database creation, so digital archiving, because it's a frontline community in the Nana region up in northwest Alaska. There's a ton of cultural artifacts and texts that need to be archived, but there are not enough archivists to do this work. So we are working with the community towards their own self-empowerment in that aspect and regard. And then I'm also the academic PI for the Inupiaq Language and Access project, which is where we are using that database and creating language revitalization frameworks using computational linguistics and natural language processing, but also, and machine learning, but also drawing potential historic ecological and cultural data from those databases as well. So we're working with the community directly on how that can be done in a way that is in a good heart.
Yes, thank you. Camila Brattland. I'm from UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, and I participated in a panel this morning, so you already know me. For this panel, perhaps it would be interesting to talk more about or delve more into data and indigenous data. And I'm currently on several projects where that is an issue. So, for instance, two biodiverse projects working on where it's a requirement to review and make an approach to data ethics, and also, of course, inclusion of indigenous data governance in research protocols. One of these is on a cross-border context between Norway and Finland, where the focus is on cross-border salmon governance. So I thought perhaps for this panel I will draw more on that experience, working across multiple countries, multiple language barriers particularly. So we can get back to that for the panel. Excited to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. You can keep the mic if you want to. So I wanted to start with a huge thank you for being on the panel. I'm really excited, and I wanted to start talking about Indigenous data sovereignty at the local and program level. I think we got a really good review from Riley about the Indigenous data sovereignty as a theory and some principles. And so the first question, what are some of the important elements of Indigenous data sovereignty, and how does it strengthen the capacities of communities to steward and use data in support of community priorities? Camila, do you want to start?
Well, it's a difficult question, and I mean, of course, all of the elements of Indigenous data sovereignty are important. Well, from my perspective or my point of view, we're still at the level where Indigenous data sovereignty is unrecognized and still struggling to implement that. But if it was to be recognized and implemented, I can just imagine how it would strengthen the capacity of those communities to steward and use data. So in our context, it's more about still being dependent on the data production and knowledge production of national scientific institutions, of governments, and to rely on their willingness and their goodwill to include indigenous data and indigenous knowledge. And this partly stems from the funding schemes, the lack of requirements on governments to include indigenous data in a tangible way, apart from just in terms of principles and you should do this, as opposed to actual hard requirements that that you must include indigenous data on which level, at a certain level. So I'm not sure what you meant about the program level. It might be a different terminology and different contexts, but at least there's no difference between Norway and Finland, which is the context that I'm working with when it comes to the struggle to reach a level where inclusion of indigenous data sovereignty is actually respected and then implemented. I think I'll get back to it later. Yep.
Thank you.
You wanted to hear from each of us?
Yeah, if you want to.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, in thinking, so I'll have a little bit of a different perspective, but in working with Indigenous data sovereignty, like what it means, like on the ground, is what I'm hearing. It really means stepping back and releasing power, right? Power is not a finite resource. Research power is not a finite resource. It is actually a capacity sharing and amplifying resource. What do I mean by that? So one thing that I've worked in creating metadata structures for like metadata application protocols and various things where we are having interns, so these are college students at our community partners through their organization. These are ELOKA students that are going to either trade school or up to PhD. So two-year schools or 9-month schools all the way up to PhD, and they can self-select to join into our research program if they find something that we're doing as interesting to them in their future careers. And so we have somebody that's working with us, and we have, like, they didn't, when we were working, like, 'cause there's a data, so let me back up for a second. About 1 year ago, I was back in Kotzebue with our research team. We were there just to like build relationships that extended beyond myself after about working together with our community partner for 1.5 years. My community partner knows me since I was a child. Like I grew up in the same community, and I've been a recipient of that same scholarship that those interns are since 1994 when I first started my undergraduate career. So they've known me and watched me and supported my career this whole time. But when I asked high school students, we had a little pilot discussion with high school students about what is data. Just asked them, what is data? They all showed us their phones. Right? That's where the conversation is starting in a lot of communities. And they're thinking of data as this resource for them to connect out to the world, right? Versus this resource that connects us to the world but helps us making decisions, right? And documenting our lived experience in the world around us. And so, you know, with that understanding, the conversations about data sovereignty are very limited, because understanding what can be done, like a lot of these organizations have been collecting data, but just to do administrative work in a lot of ways, and just kind of annotation of things that have been done, but actually crunching information and understanding what, like the stories that are contained in their own community data has been decently limited in a lot of cases. And so in working with with our organization, we realized that we were like to have these conversations about how their data, how we can use their data in this and work with them and create data together that that protects their sovereignty and their self-governance, required us to like start somewhere and then have us play together with data to see what it does. Because as my mom asked me, I always talk about my family, by the way, but as my mom asked me, and when we were saying, oh yeah, we're gonna try to make these community archives, we're gonna try to do these things and, you know, create this database, whatever, and my mom said, what can they do to us with this? That's the perspective. What can they do to us with this data? And because that's that history that Alice was talking about in the opening remarks for AOS, there's a history of extractive research that we cannot deny. Maybe we are not people that have contributed to it, right? Maybe we're the people trying to change it, but we still, even myself, are like part of that legacy, and we have to work towards the community. So in talking about Indigenous data sovereignty, we have had to actually build in time for like data to be visualized, for them to like critique what we're doing and help us create, you know, a better metadata application protocol, so our variables and the definitions for those variables as the community sees fit, because having them think about it conceptually without a tangible, like a tangible offering didn't work. So instead we like, you know, digitized like a shoebox of stuff and played with it. And then they started to see, oh, this is what we can do, and then started to help us create, you know, more robust metadata, you know, choices and plans, and also definitions. So I think that is like the question before the question, is like, how do we get there to have these conversations actually about data sovereignty?
Thanks, Cana. Hard to follow, but I like that thread, and so I think I'm going to go back to like my roots too, and a little bit of like what data is to me, and again like that conception of like starting there before figuring out how it goes to on the ground. So my background is in environmental studies and sustainability and marine policy. Those of you that are close to me know that I endearingly call myself a recovering scientist, because I was working and training in these systems and thinking of data in such a linear way. And the reality is that it is also something that is needing to be played with. As Cana said, I'm going to keep that in my, that's really helping me think through it as well, because it is something that you need to recognize that data is all around us. We are constantly transmitting and communicating and sharing information. It might not be in an Excel format, but we are always in relationship and receiving information from our communities, our relatives, everything around us. So with the work that I do, I never thought I would be, after I like left academia and I now work in the nexus. I bridge all of our worlds from community level to policy to research and back to the community level. And I never thought I would be in app and tech design or building databases or thinking about how to protect data while still trying to communicate it in a way that is understandable. And so on the ground level, the work that we do with ISN and a lot of what I was seeing the need when we were trying to do co-production or creation or collaborative projects with a lot of the tribes that we work with throughout Alaska is that fear of what can they do to us with this information, or how is this data going to eventually come back and maybe affect our subsistence hunting, or how can we also access data on a local level to make our climate adaptation plans, because a lot of that data is missing at that very fine scale region sometimes. And so when we talk about doing collaborative projects and research with Indigenous communities, there is this need and respect and requirement, as was touched on earlier, to protect the data. So ISN offers that community-owned data. It's protected. We work that. We make sure that as we are collecting data, that is communicated throughout the entire process, and we are constantly checking in with them about how we want to share things, how they want it communicated. And really, when we think about Indigenous data, it can include, you know, environmental, individual, and cultural level, but it was mentioned in the talk that we just watched that it's also collective from the perspective that we are operating in the knowledge systems and data systems that we work with. And so going back to playing with data, when I get lost in some of this, because it is complex, but as it should be, you know, data is a common vocabulary for art and science. And I think that's also a way that we need to think about Indigenous data sovereignty and the protocols that we're creating and the databases that we're creating, to be really creative with that approach, to be flexible. And then really, I would like to share like also a quote that really helps me piece together a lot of the translation that we're trying to do with knowledge systems, with data systems. Those of you that are familiar with Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Kimmon's book, she mentions, you know, to be heard, you must speak the language of the one you want to listen. And I think that's tied into a lot of our language relearning, tied into a lot of this effort to be better communicators with each other. And so when I think about Indigenous data sovereignty, I really also think about that responsibility it has on us to be forever learners and curious and open to each other, to thinking about data in a different way. And that's how it really plays out on the ground too, is approaching it, having the communities come to the researchers and having that space to really think about how they want their information shared and managed and protected. So.
I appreciate the acknowledgement that it was a hard question here. And so I'm gonna start out with an example. So ELOKA, the Alaska Arctic Observatory and Knowledge Hub, we work with a network of observers in Arctic Alaska, Kotzebue, Point Hope, Utqagvik, and Kaktovik. And these Inupiaq observers, they document daily to weekly observations of weather, sea ice, wildlife, community activities, gathering activities, the whole 9 yards, you know. And so they document these observations in a variety of different ways. And those observations are sent to us and housed in the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic, the ELOKA database that we partner with ELOKA to run. And so in the last 2 years, we've been in a planning phase. ELOKA, as an observing network, has existed since 2006. I joined 2 years ago. And so the last 2 years, we've been in a planning phase with the observers, with our steering group, with our partners to ask, what should we do? What would you like us to do with your observations? What are your priorities? What are your concerns? And what can we do to facilitate your vision? And part of that includes meeting in person, flying them to you or you flying to them. To meet in person and have these discussions. And so part of that planning phase for us included meetings and workshops around our observing priorities and the database. And so we had this question of, what audiences are you concerned about? And what audiences would you like to prioritize, to emphasize? And so from that, we've in the last 2 years, we heard that, you know, their observations can really be useful for wildlife co-management organizations in Alaska. But there's also this fear of what can people do with these observations? On the flip side, we understand that our hunting and subsistence rights in Alaska can, you know, they are at risk if the wrong eyes are seeing something and they interpret it wrong. People might want to say like, hey, they shouldn't be whaling anymore, or they shouldn't be catching seals. And so there's that line of, you know, we want to emphasize audiences that can use these observations, but also we want to be aware that there's that risk. But I just also want to mention each of the observers joined ELOKA because they want to share their knowledge. They want to share their observations. They want it out there. And so that's where we're coming from. That's where we're operating from. As part of that meeting I mentioned earlier, we also made changes to our data use agreement, which is the use agreement that you need to read and agree to before accessing the database. And so we made some changes to that with a note on restricting use of these observations to infringe on Indigenous subsistence hunting, fishing, harvesting, gathering rights. And so we made that change. There was also a note from the observers about the citation and about being inclusive of our collective team. So I mentioned ELOKA started in 2006. Many of the observers that were part of the program back then are not part of the program now. And so our observers recognize that this body of knowledge isn't just coming from who's on the team today. That team can change, and so we adjusted also our citation. And it's kind of a, in these academic spaces, we're really, are concerned about citations and references and making sure we include people as authors and reference them. But for the observers, they understood that though we are a team today, right now, our team could change in the future. And so we changed that database citation to observers of coastal Arctic Alaska. And even on the university side, we changed our names to just the ELOKA team, I think is what it was. And so those are some of the actions that we've taken to support Indigenous data sovereignty. And I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for those answers. We have 10 minutes left for the panel, so I think we're going to do one more question. Something that I noticed in the answers was relationships, and this was kind of like implicitly shared. And so when we were planning this session, we wanted to create some space to talk about relationships. So whoever wants to answer this question, in your experience, how does Indigenous data sovereignty influence relationships between Indigenous nations and communities and external entities such as researchers or government agencies?
I'll keep this short. I think that it builds trust. It builds trust between you and your community partners, and then also trust by the community to apply any conclusions or observations made from that effort into their local decision making. If the observations, the data is coming from local people who are involved in the project, you're more likely to use those observations in decision-making contexts. So it builds trust, I would say.
I think it might be a little bit of an echo down the chain, but I definitely think it builds trust and connection, but I also think it builds an opportunity to be transparent with each other. This isn't just also about like trust or like a relationship between two different people. It's also a relationship to yourself as a researcher, as someone who has experienced a lot of removal of my own identity throughout. I came back to myself and my roots very late in life. I mean, I'm still young, but it does feel like very late that I'm kind of rediscovering the perceptions and value systems that I want and need to, and that we all are responsible to operate in. And I think a lot of what research and these data systems and these hierarchical structures of knowledge instill is this idea that it is unbiased, or that it is an expertise, or one knowledge system is above another. And really with like digital data systems, especially when you are building them, as someone who's been working in this space, they're not neutral, and they carry a lot of biases about what fields are included. Again, to Roberta's point, how you credit, who owns that data, and it's not a reciprocal ownership. It is not something that it removes this aspect of responsibility to ask those questions of each other and yourself of how you are seeing this data and the way that it is presented. And really with a lot of what it affects, I think, with the relationships to other entities is this idea that it's again going back to, I think, what I'm dealing with the entities is also just clear communication between each other. So that relationship allows you to just have that curiosity, have those questions, ask the hard questions, listen deeply when someone is pointing out a bias that you have that you were thinking that when you were unbiased. And then fixing those systems, that's where the creativity needs to come in, and that's where I loved your point, Cana, about hope in this process. We are rebuilding something that can be better and that can be more inclusive. And I think the local context labels that were mentioned earlier is something that I'm going to be carrying forward in my work with ISN when we're talking about the database, and to Roberta's point, wanting to share out the data, doing that properly with a labeling system that talks transparently to researchers about who owns it, how it should be used, and who to contact after the fact. I think we can really get creative with the systems on the back end to help us all communicate clearer, especially if we don't have, with the funding constraints, the ability to go to communities. But as a researcher, or if you're a funder, like, we need to continuously emphasize that going to communities, it needs to start there. So.
Thank you. So in thinking about how data serves cross organizations and such, I'm going to have I'm going to pick up on data ownership here. One thing that so I'm a technical communicator. That means I'm kind of like, so I'm in the English department, which is where a lot of lawyers start their undergraduate degree, right? We do close readings, and the technical communicators, we read policy. So I'm like a little bulldog for policy, I'm just gonna say. I would love to go to law school. If anybody wants a job offer, like, that has a law school, I'm willing to talk. So one thing I think about and I share about is that the choices you make that seem unrelated to data affect data sovereignty. I will give you one example. I'm going to take it from an NSF funding proposal submission perspective, okay? So in an NSF funding proposal, you can submit two ways, either as a single submission or a collaboration, right? Where every institution that's a subaward submits their own thing to NSF. I'm not sure what it is in these other contexts, but this is how it is in the United States. And what's really interesting is that oftentimes, right, like I might serve as the PI for a funding application because Virginia Tech has like resources and capacities to fulfill that role that maybe my community partner does not want to do. So let's say I do that. Then my community partner is a subaward, or maybe the relationship's flipped and they are the primary investigator, and then Virginia Tech is a subaward. In that process, the subaward process, because you can create memorandums of agreement, you can make data agreements, you can do all that stuff, but those are actually just agreements. They are not legally binding in a lot of cases. So what is legally binding in the research world? Well, when money gets involved, it gets really legally binding. And so subaward contracts, there is usually default language within subaward contracts related to intellectual property. And as the PI, you often are the person that negotiates with the contracts office at your university or institution, and then this other people negotiate, right? And so you can use your power to help make sure that the subaward contract has clauses that protects Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data and intellectual property, right, for the community. Because the default, at least at my university, is the default for ownership of intellectual property goes to the university that's the PI. That is like, or that's, that is part of that. So also, if you are working in the United States and you are working for a government or a state agency, you have to really be aware of the Freedom of Information Act. So like me, all my emails, all those different things are FOIA-able, right? And so people can request information because I work for the state at Virginia Tech. And so if I am transmitting data in certain ways, they actually can become FOIA-able. So thinking about the mechanics, these things that seem very unrelated to Indigenous data sovereignty can affect that sovereignty and governance. So those are two tips so you don't break a trust by doing something that seems normal in your everyday working practice that can actually put the community at risk.
Thank you. I think when I read the question and heard the question, I thought maybe I didn't have anything to contribute to here, but maybe I can contribute with a contrast, because it sounds, I also read about the Alaskan projects, and for our context, this sounds like another dimension of indigenous data sovereignty and organizing observations and having a kind of a collection of observations on that geographical and temporal scale is sounds fantastic, and for it even to be indigenous led and community led is also a dream. So perhaps a contrasting experience, or what I can offer from the Sami perspective, is that these concepts are so unfamiliar, and the idea of actually having right to data and actually being aware that you should actually be informed about and participate in data production and knowledge production is something which I think it needs a lot of training and education and building up from the ground for even local governments to take a stand in relation to. So I think now when I see the question again, I mean, even just the concept of people thinking about their right to data, I think really changes everything in the relationship between communities and external entities. So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone on the panel. If you wouldn't mind staying up a little bit longer, I think we're going to have some questions. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Noor to facilitate the second half of the session.
Well, first, let's just go ahead and thank our panelists. So as Chantal mentioned at the opening of this session, this is part of sort of a series of this data sharing working group, and we have two of the series that are going to be focused on Indigenous data sovereignty. And so, I think the organizers really wanted to start us off with some expertise, and to just really hear from people who have thought and kind of worked in the Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous data space. And so we've heard from this panel, we've sort of heard some initial reflections. I feel like we could hear from them for many more hours and be very satisfied, but unfortunately we only have half an hour left in this session. So I think what we want to do is just give people who are in the room the chance to maybe ask questions of the panel or offer reflections if there's something that sparked your interest or sparked your thinking. And then we want to kind of move towards thinking about whether there's some recommendations that we've heard or something that could start to move us towards recommendations in the Indigenous data sovereignty space. So we'll start with any comments or questions that people in the room might have for the panel.
Hi. I just had a question about global organizations like...
Sorry, would you introduce yourself too?
Yes.
Before the question?
I'm Melissa. I'm a biology undergrad in Vancouver, Canada. And I was doing a mock debate in class the other day, conservation biology, and we were talking about the polar bear debate in Arctic communities. And I was wondering about like IUCN Red List and COSWIC and how these global organizations make calls on polar bears and basically restrict their hunting, but it affects the indigenous communities which eat the bears, hunt the bears, make money off of bear hunts, stuff like that. Where do you see, I guess, the communication between indigenous communities, federal governments, global organizations? How do you, I don't know what my question is, but like how do these connect? How do they talk to each other? How do we solve that problem?
Anyone able to respond, Roberta?
I mentioned wildlife co-management agencies. Those are the groups that work with the federal people as well as representatives from Indigenous communities to understand how to manage different wildlife resources. There are issues with those management organizations in terms of equity, in terms of whose knowledge is being valued in making those decisions. I think there's a lot of work to be done to support Indigenous knowledge and observations to be more of a, more of a say to make it more balanced. But those are the organizations in Alaska, at least.
Yeah.
I always appreciate the technical work that comes into this setting. Come for you first. I've been here the whole week. This is the first so this is pretty still impressive.
If it's not a quick fix, we'll continue without it, and then you can keep working on it. It's not a quick fix. Okay, so we'll carry on because we don't have a lot of time. So Hannah Marie, go ahead.
And I've been told I have a soft voice, so I will do my best to project. To build off of Roberta's example of co-management, I think that's something to just, as an undergrad, maybe look into that too, especially coming from Canada. It's just a US-based example. But especially, I want to emphasize there are still issues with that structure in addressing some of the challenges. It is a start. And there's also another way of co-stewardship, another term that has been brought up into the discussion as well. I'm speaking, I'm not from St. Paul, but I'm going to share an example of how kind of that integration and hunting rights is involved with some of the work that we do with ISN. So the Indigenous Sentinels Network was established 20 years ago actually in this response of need to co-manage northern fur seals on the Priffloff Islands. There's a lot of history. I don't know if we have time, and I'm probably not the most appropriate person to share that history, so please look into that. But there is basically the database that the tribe was collecting data on northern fur seals, and the National Oceanic Administration's National Fisheries Service, acronyms, SOUP, I forget the proper department of NOAA's many departments that does co-management, wanted to assert control over that data. So the tribe founded ISN in response of that, creating their own privately owned database and asserting we need to do co-management if we are going to be sharing any sort of information on our northern fur seals, and we want to be involved in those decisions that is affecting the harvest of that subsistence resource. So that is something of an example to build off of for first point, is co-management is a structure of that is, and then now there's data sharing. We do annual harvest. Our tribe employs 3 full-time sentinels that are community members, and they collect and do surveys year-round on the rookeries, how many pups are harvested, how many females are there, the weather observations that come into play, and how, if you'll allow me to nerd out for a minute, that also opens the door for more discovery beyond just management. Is we were actually able to also ground truth some of the modeling that was happening with northern fur seals. So predicting when females and pups would depart from the island is important for understanding the population dynamics associated with that species, and therefore how much you can harvest. And we based on the real-time observations, NOAA's not there on the island 24/7. They are not the local experts. The community on St. Paul is. And with the data that we were collecting, we were actually able to ground truth some of the modeling that they were doing looking into the next couple seasons. So there's this dip in the fall of like forest seals not really being counted on the island, and no one was really, they just knew that happened, it was kind of forecast. But we were able to ground truth that with weather observations and local observations, contextual like recorded observations from our sentinels being like the surf was pounding on the shore, so a lot of the pups were getting washed into the water, and so that's why the counts are really low during that month, is because of the increasing storms on the island. And so that helps model forecasting. And so all of that is kind of an example of blending, how that plays into management. But when you open the door for communities to allow more data, not just thinking in one area of like, we just want counts to inform how much you can harvest, it's another example. But again, do want to emphasize there's still equity issues in co-management, as Roberta mentioned, but it is something to look at for a model.
Thanks. Anyone else want to comment on that? And if not, we can. No?
Thank you. I just want to start off, first of all, by thanking the panelists. Thanks for your insight. My name is Sean Tippett. I'm a member of Ocean Networks Canada on the west coast of British Columbia. At Ocean Networks Canada, like I'll just give a little bit of context. I think there are a lot of things we're doing well in terms of engaging with Indigenous communities. We have many ongoing relationships with Indigenous communities on the coast of British Columbia. Some of those things include subsea cabled observatories on their territories. And we actually have ownership basically given to those communities of that data, and things such as agreements and underlying financial agreements. My question kind of comes more into like the fair and care interplay, and especially in terms of local contexts, because that's something my organization is looking at incorporating. But we find that a lot of communities don't actually know what local contexts are, and they're also maybe not like that. There's not a lot of buy-in from local contexts. So I was wondering just what your thoughts are on like pushing something that we think is good for a community, but maybe there's just no initial will for that thing to be used. Any thoughts on that?
Great, thanks for that question. And I'll note that we did invite local contexts to be part of the conversation. They're not here this week, but I know they're open to having follow-up discussion, and so just wanted to mention that. That's the group that was mentioned in the introductory video about that has developed these labels that you can use. And I think, to me, this question actually also goes back to the point that, Cana, that you were making earlier about you know, to be able to really engage community members in discussions about data, there has to be some initial work done to kind of get everyone on the same page, is what I heard you say. So I think that's a little bit of the points a little bit to the question that, is it Sean?
Yes.
Sean is asking. Anyone able to respond or talk a little bit more about that piece?
I'm not sure I'm going to be answering directly, so just hear the indirect and maybe there'll be something. Okay. So one thing that I like to think about when engaging communities, and I said that earlier today already, is, you know, like the so what, right? Like letting people like, but what does the so what actually mean? It means sparking curiosity, right? And getting people to like think about like all this beautiful amounts of knowledge that is available to them because of scientific practices that has already happened, and how can that information be relevant at home? It is relevant at home. And so like for us in our projects is we've had to rely on other people's data or small sets, and just like I said earlier, playing with the data to get them curious and excited and engaged, because there is not just, there are a lot, especially, you know, in Indigenous communities that are already participating in research or are often asked to participate in research. There's like a bunch of people kind of knocking at the door at the same time trying to get attention. And so being able to coordinate what you are doing with already existing community initiatives and goals, and using existing data sets that you might have access to like demonstrate the power of what the types of things you're trying to, you know, like showing the gap, right? But showing what is there, but also what if we knew this, then we could do this as well. Like, and this relates to you, I think is really what needs to happen, because, you know, the data we were collecting was off of photographs, and it was really interesting to see how certain people coded when they saw pictures with snow, right? They coded it as occurring like in winter. All of us likely have been to the Arctic. There is snow in the spring, and you have to, it doesn't necessarily mean it's winter time. But if I'm thinking about my, you know, where I live in Virginia and the east coast of the United States, snow definitely means winter. So, it's been really funny to, like, one thing that we did to try to get people interested in helping us code data was showing them that mistake. We showed them, like, here are some scenes of the winter, and we show these pictures where I know, and my kid, you know, whoever, like, that's from the Arctic was like, that's not winter. Look what they're wearing. They have their shirt off. They're like this, you know, or they're cutting up this certain thing, or they're doing, you know, whatever it is, and saying, this is, you know, activities in the winter, and just seeing the faces go, and then be like, that's what happened when we didn't have you involved in being part of our data, right? And like coding it. And so then they start seeing where they can contribute and where indigenous knowledge is, right? Of like, oh, that's a spring seal, right? That's this. And so having that be part of how we like spark curiosity, but also like awaken expertise, because we are often so like feeling that we might not be experts in something. And when we can show a demonstration of exactly why we indigenous people from the Arctic are necessary to this, and how we can contribute to the rigor of science, and with a tangible evidence of that, right? Then that sparks, like, I should be involved. I want to be involved. I can contribute with what I already know. And that's an important part.
Thank you, Cana. I can't really follow it up, but I think to just emphasize what you meant, meeting people where they're at, getting people curious. All of us in this room already have a better grasp, a little bit, but maybe like, or just hearing for it for the first time. In the communities too, like, I'm gonna quote Alaska Native Elder in our community, Warren Jones, move at the speed of trust. You just have to be patient. If they're not buying in, they're not going to buy in any faster the more you repeat it. Or you have to provide the examples, or take a step back and stop talking about it for a minute and just be human. Just connect with them. An example I'll share too is our ISN Powers, the Skipper Science Partnership Program in Alaska that's working with commercial fishermen to collect data using the tool. I'll go walk docks all day. I can walk docks and walk up to a boat with the clipboard or flyer hidden behind my back and still try to tell them about the project and get really nowhere. But then I'll go to the bar later and they'll be like, hey, you're the Skipper Science girl. Tell me more about that. Go to bingo. Go to bingo. Way too many nights spent out late, but you just have to, that's again goes back to being in community. And I know this is also like a systemic funding structure issue, like your researchers and your center at the time. If you can just spend a day doing nothing, not talking at them and just listening, that's, and also stop, I'm going to say this gently too, even the phrase like buying in, not okay to be like in that context of trying to sell something to a community if they're not ready or if they're not interested. It has to be a conversation. Data is not a product. Knowledge is not a product to like start to work with. So also being very cognizant of the language you're using when you're explaining systems too, and being reciprocal to like feedback and trying to figure out how to explain this very complex data labeling and metadata and how it's being carried into the back end. And as Cana pointed out, just an example of how it really impacts them on their scale and where they're at, and moving at the speed of trust, which I know is all really difficult in this room since we're all trying to fight something that feels really, really urgent and really, really overwhelming. So a little bit of advice, moving at the speed of trust, to quote Warren Jones, and just continuing the conversation. Keep repeating it, but do it in a gentle way and trying to meet them where they're at.
One of the things I also thought to mention, Sean, when thinking about your question, was that in Riley's presentation, she did mention that there were these different sort of scales, that she talked about care being at the kind of the meta, the global scale. And I think of those local context labels as sort of existing in that space of they're supposed to be applicable. You can take them and apply them, but they're sort of up here. And then she said the primary scale is that local scale. So look to the guidance of the local communities that you're working with and how they want to have their data respected. So there may be other tools that would be more meaningful to them. I'm sort of, that's sparked my curiosity about that. One of the things we had hoped to do in this session was to kind of hear some examples or some practices that the panelists shared of how data sovereignty has been implemented. And I think we did hear some, and we'll hear some more tomorrow in the technical panel. But I want to make sure that all of our panelists had the chance to share the examples that they wanted to share. Camila, I don't know. I want to make sure that I thought you sort of had an example, and I want to make sure you were able to share it. We didn't get to ask all of the questions. So is there anything that you would like to share from your experience and practice in working in the Sami regions that people might like to hear about?
Yeah, thanks. So I've been working over the last couple of years comparing Sami and other Arctic indigenous practices of indigenous participation in salmon governance and indigenous participation in knowledge production for salmon governance. And one of the important realizations maybe is that the core difference between whether you see an indigenous-led knowledge production process, also including data governance, or not, is whether the territory is recognized, the indigenous territory is recognized, and there is an indigenous governance body. And in most cases, in the Sami case, there is one example of a territory that you can compare to First Nations or other bounded where indigenous peoples have recognized territory, is the Skolt Sami community in northern Finland, which is one of the only kind of comparable communities with a tribal with something you can compare to a tribal council. Yeah. So in that case, knowledge production and collaboration between community and researchers coming in, it's at the level where you all are discussing, in a way, where you have a recognized indigenous government who can make decisions, who can make community priorities, who are updated and who can work with researchers and networks such as No Change on data production, data governance, and so on. But for the rest, it's really a slippery context to work in. So, for instance, the Sami Parliament of Finland recently, or not recently, but they implemented a protocol where researchers have to apply for free, prior and informed consent to do research in Sami territories. The Norwegian Sami Parliament do not have the same principles, but they are starting to now implement the same ones. And that governing body represents all of the Sami people, and if you're doing a regional project such as on the Detno or Tana River, where the salmon migrates across borders and into the coastal, but not all across the Sami territory, the Sami Parliament will not be the proper governing body to make that decision on behalf of those communities in that space. So, but what they can do is to point at who are the proper communities and who are the proper actors that researchers can work with. So I just wanted to share that there are different levels of governance, and it impacts the relationship between, also when it comes to knowledge production and indigenous data governance. And in this case, it's also a matter of researchers do not speak Sami language. People across the border do not understand Norwegian and Finnish, for instance, but they speak Sami language across the border. So this also creates a lot of communication issues when you, perhaps as a Finnish-speaking researcher coming into a Norwegian Sami-speaking setting, do not understand the local language. And as a Norwegian researcher, I cannot go to the other side of the river to do research there because I do not understand Finnish, but I need to have a competence in Sami language. So this also creates a lot of like intercultural and translation costs. So what we end up doing, for instance, is to do smaller meetings in indigenous languages, and then gathering also all the researchers together at some point to share knowledge and to share consent forms, to have them translated from English to Finnish to Norwegian to Sami. So you need consent forms and agreements in multiple languages just to get to the point that you can actually start doing the research, and also negotiating with multiple governance bodies. And yeah, so just to give an example of the complexity of those negotiations when governance institutions are not already recognized and in place, but when they are, you know, so I think that a lot of the discussions on data governance, indigenous data governance, presumes a setting where you have recognized First Nations and recognized indigenous governments.
Anyone else want to make a final comment? We have 5 minutes left, so this has flown by. If there's any final thoughts or comments that the panelists would like to share, you're welcome. Anyone? And if not, yeah, we have time for one more question. Great.
Hello, hi. Thank you for your openness and for sharing your experiences. I learned a lot from all of you. So my question is on the data management plan for projects. And maybe if you have experience as PIs, so you all know you develop data management plans for your projects, and the ultimate goal is fair compliance, right? Open, as long as it's open and available for everyone. There's really no care portion of data management plan templates available. So, oh, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Hi, I'm Cindy Garcia. I'm from NOAA, Arctic Research Program. And I'm just thinking about, you know, your challenge earlier about thinking about changing structures. And that's one important piece in making projects for our PIs to be thoughtful about how we share our data and how we manage our data. It starts with that plan. And whether they comply, you know, that's another question. But yeah, just the experience of adding that care principles in the data management plan of our PIs, and obviously it involves the consultation, et cetera, but just putting those structures in that plan that they submit to agencies, funding agencies. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, but that was kind of a perfect segue because I wrote down what you said word for word. One thing we're looking for is recommendations. And so that sounds like a perfect recommendation to bring to US government agencies that are funding Arctic science, that the care principles would be part of the data management plan that was required. So I wrote it down. That's something we could consider. Are there any other thoughts on recommendations, like things that you heard today? I have some that I wrote down, and they're sort of not well thought out yet. I hope we'll spend some more time. But I wrote, oh, there's a comment. Good. So we'll keep, good. Let's brainstorm some suggestions and recommendations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Hannah Stepetin Amunangach. I'm from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, and a climate change researcher. So I'm thinking a lot about equity. After having our conversation this morning and listening to some of the speakers here, this feels very like US dominant and centric and North American dominant. So I'm wondering perhaps like, it sounds like in Sapmi there's lots of, maybe it's behind. It's like they don't have these opportunities for Indigenous data sovereignty in ways that perhaps the US and Canada, North America is. I'm wondering, like, are there ways for us, this is a recommendation, to move towards international funding and knowledge sharing opportunities with our Sami relatives, and I mean, hopefully also Russian Indigenous relatives too, because Indigenous sovereignty is not just something that belongs in North America.
Any last comments or points before we break for lunch? And then we can also keep thinking and reflecting and carry the conversation into tomorrow. Anyone else want to raise a last point or recommendation before we break?
Hi, my name is Allison Gaylord, and I'm based in Homer, Alaska. I met some of you folks in various forums. I had a question about how do we best catalog information that's coming out of Indigenous observation efforts? I'm a GIS and remote sensing specialist. I've worked in the Arctic since 1995 for the North Slope Bureau with Roberta's parents, actually, and I've been involved in a number of data compilation activities. But when it comes to actually compiling information about all the work that's being done and making sure that we're accurately giving credit and reflecting those initiatives, I think there needs to be like some oversight from some group in the Arctic or Alaska to look at the cataloging and registry efforts that USAON and SAON is doing. And I know everybody's so overworked, overtasked, and who do we pull in to say, okay, some of this work that maybe has had a genesis in Itchuaqiyak has evolved over the years. Who do we go back to and say, okay, are we still doing, who do we check back with to see if this is relevant to the communities without overwhelming people? And how do we give appropriate credit? So that was my recommendation, I guess, and question.
Thanks. I may come back to you, Allison, for some more specifics. I tried to capture that. Does anyone have a response? It was a question and a pointing towards a recommendation, but does any panelists want to respond, or anyone else in the room? And if not, we can leave it as an open question to come back to. Did you have a response, Camila?
Oh, did you? Well, as a non-American, I mean, this is not my territory at all, but I had the impression that the land use and occupancy mapping practices carried through for court proceedings. I mean, that's a kind of field in itself, which is, well, I just saw the comment by Terry Tobias, who did the land use and occupancy kind of Bible, commenting that this is a field which has been kind of over the last 40, 50 years in the same place, but it has its own exactly like terminology for what to catalog and how to register, and a very developed method, which obviously has served very well in land claims agreements centered on map biographies. So I don't know if that's useful or helpful, but if anybody knows about how that field or the state of that field is doing today, because that's also something I didn't follow in the last 10 years. So thanks.
Okay, great. Well, I think it's time to close for today, just to make sure we have enough time for lunch. So again, let's thank our panelists. Thank you so much. And so tomorrow we'll have another panel focused more on technical implementation, and we'll also have more time for discussion because today we had that sort of introduction from the collaboratory that took some of our time. It's clear that there's a lot of expertise in the room, and so we want to make sure there's time for more discussion tomorrow. But thanks everybody for your contributions today.